This is made possible with support from the Robert Schalkenbach Foundation and also the Foundation for Economic Justice, the Henry George Institute, Common Ground USA, Earth Sharing Associates, and individual donors. So anyhow, I want to talk about jury democracy. And jury democracy can work for governments, for corporations, for nonprofits, and something I'm interested in is for land trusts. And so I wanted to start off by talking about the difference between democracy versus aristocracy. Democracy means government by the people, and aristocracy means government by the best. And what happened with hereditary aristocracy is, you'll hear rich people say, well, all the best people were there. But that's not really a true aristocracy. Jefferson talked about elections with the hope that we would elect a true aristoi. In other words, we would be governed by the best, but we would choose the best in elections. And that was the hope for electoral democracy. The Greek democracy, this is a book by Paul Woodruff. It's a very good book. And he goes through how the Greek system evolved and the problems that they had with it, and the tyrannies that they got rid of and brought about this in response to these tyrannies. But they had direct democracy at the village level. In other words, government was very local, and whoever showed up got to make the decision. That has a little bit of a problem because the most meddlesome people tend to be the ones who show up, and the ones who have a vested interest in an outcome tend to be the ones who show up. So that itself was not ideal. But their Greek Senate was chosen by lottery among, I think, the property owning classes, certainly among the non-slave classes. So if you were a slave, you didn't get to be part of the, you didn't get a chance to be on the Senate. This was called sortition. It means that the actual leaders who will rule the country are chosen by lottery. And that's true democracy without any aristocracy. Generals and treasurers were chosen on merit because an incompetent general could lose and an incompetent or corrupt treasurer could abscond with all your money. And it turns out the treasurers, the Greeks had a very high incidence of executing treasurers. So it was a job that you worried about doing right, because you could get executed for losing money, not just for stealing money. So anyhow, there's much more to it than that, and it's a very good book if anybody's interested. But anyhow, that's kind of where I learned some of the things about how the Greek democracies worked. And I wanted to get into the question of what's the difference between a mob and a jury. A mob self-selects and a jury is selected. A mob starts with an agenda and a jury starts with a duty. I mean, the mob assembles because they have some agenda. Mobs act on outrage and juries deliberate, and mobs stifle dissent and are much easier to manipulate than juries are. This is a quote by a very famous person, famous to me, is deliberation is the soul of democracy. To me, deliberation is what is the essential ingredient in democracy, that and being genuinely representative of the larger body. So the next question is, how much is majority rule like mob rule? To some degree, voters self-select. Anybody can vote, but voters are encouraged to have agendas. We motivate people to vote by pandering to their agendas. Election campaigns promote outrage. Politics stifle dissent in echo chambers, and there's this correlation between politics and warfare. I'll get into each of these. So, yeah, the previous one was First Democracy by Paul Woodruff. And that's the one that Steve wanted and the thing too. So the difference between a mob and a jury is that, this is not, okay. So now my camera's gone.
Oh. But we can see you.
Okay. So the difference between a mob and a jury, I went through. Deliberation is the soul of democracy. Majority rule and mob rule. In majority rule, voters self-select. Voters are encouraged to have agendas. Election campaigns promote outrage. Politics stifle dissent in echo chambers. And there is a correlation between politics and warfare. Homeowners, when we talk about voters self-select, homeowners vote a lot more than renters. They also vote especially more in local elections and in minor elections like magistrates and judges and school board. And homeowners vote more on pocketbook issues. You know, so even when renters vote, they want to know your position on various emotional issues. What's your position on abortion? What's your position on gay rights? What's your position on war? What, you know, whatever. And homeowners want to know, will you get my street paved? You know, what are you going to do with taxes? Those kind of things. Extremists vote more than moderates. So the more right-wing or left-wing, or it could be an extremist on one particular issue, but the more extremist people are, the more likely they are to vote. And meddlesome people vote more than accommodating people. Accommodating people are the ones who will get along with whatever comes down. And as a result, campaigners focus on getting out the vote versus persuading people. They say, what are the issues you already care about? We'll tell you how terrible the opponent is on those issues. So hysteria becomes a get out the vote device. Voter agendas are encouraged. Politicians pander to interest groups. Interest groups have made this much worse by creating questionnaires. So they're encouraging politicians to commit themselves well in advance of deliberating on the issue. So it's the deliberation of voters is harmed. The deliberation of elected officials is also harmed. People have said the only thing worse than a politician who breaks all his promises is a politician who keeps them, because usually those promises were special interest promises. And campaign donations are a form of institutionalized bribery. It's illegal to donate money to a politician and he puts that money in his bank account, in his personal account. But what he wants more than anything is to be elected, and it's perfectly legal and acceptable to give him money. So there's an institutional bribery aspect in it. And you can't stop that. I mean, they've said, well, you can't donate money. You know, people donate money to politicians. We want to restrict that, or we want to have public financing of elections. But now we have people who are right-wing or left-wing who are buying entire newspaper chains. So how do you prevent somebody from buying an election when he can buy, you know, when Rupert Murdoch can buy an entire news media conglomerate? So that institutionalized bribery is inherent in majority rule systems. And people are encouraged to put personal interest before public interest. They are encouraged to campaign and win. If you win, to the victors goes the spoils. So elections promote outrage. Vilifying opponents is big on electoral politics. Fear is a major motivator. Most people who voted for Trump voted for him because they disliked Hillary so much, and most people who voted for Hillary disliked Trump. And outrage stifles dissent. In the primaries, we had, Marty O'Malley was the governor of Maryland. He had been the mayor of Baltimore. He was a very good candidate. And from our point of view, he was a promoter of land value tax for Baltimore. But he got taken out because he said, because when Black Lives Matter formed, he said he was like one of the first people to say, well, all lives should matter, and they crucified him for that. Even though he had been the mayor of Baltimore, you can't be anti-Black and be the mayor of Baltimore. It just isn't going to happen. So the people who knew him knew he was very good on race issues, but the outrage machine still got him. And so we had to choose between the corporate hack and the raving socialist. That is part of the nature of this thing. Echo chambers, it's all us versus them, tribalism. I did a presentation at I think the Pittsburgh conference called Power versus Reason. Power struggles get a much bigger boost in this mechanism than reason does. And this has gotten worse under social media, but it's always been a problem. And when we think about, the elections are a metaphor for warfare. So we talk about, substituting ballots for bullets, party strongholds. Majority rule is basically, in a real military battle, if you have the most people, you win unless the other side has the most weapons or the most money to buy weapons. And so the campaign war chests become a big issue. Your loyalty is questioned if you disagree. It's all about winning versus serving. Majority rule politics is basically, if we get the majority, then we don't have, if you're the minority, you lose. And if you're the majority, you win. And so the whole system is not a deliberation system, it is a battle system. So the jury has advantages over all those, in that the jury is pure deliberation. And none of those things are true when you get into the jury system. Now, there are disadvantages of the jury. One is random intelligence. So a jury can be below average. Theoretically, half of the juries are going to be at or below average in intelligence. The juries can be a non-representative sample. There can be jury tampering, although voter tampering is the standard and jury tampering is the exception. There can be domination by one or more jurors. There are trade-offs in the size of the jury. An election is basically a jury of everyone who shows up. So an election, a presidential election is basically a jury of 1 to 200 million. And obviously when the jury is that size, intelligent deliberation is impossible. But if the jury is too small, then the chances of it being non-representative are very good. And the jury we think of is a passive process. We call it trial by jury, but it's really a trial by the judge and the lawyers in front of the jury. And the other problem with jury duty or juries is that people escape jury duty. And it's usually the most intelligent people, the most, the self-employed, the people who don't work for a big corporation who escape jury duty. Corporations usually give you your pay. Large corporations give you your pay while you serve jury duty. So what you get paid for jury duty is on top of your pay. So one of the things about current juries is that they are stacked in favor of people on welfare, people who work for corporations, people who work for government. And the rest of the public tends to escape jury duty, which is, you know, I'm not going to blame them for that, but it is a disadvantage of the jury. So how do we address those disadvantages? Random intelligence can be addressed by using the jury to choose leaders instead of using the jury to lead. So the Greeks just took people at random and said, you are now the Senate. What I'm suggesting is you take people at random and you say, you will screen the people who want to be the leaders, and then you or a subsequent jury will actually choose the leaders from the ones that were screened. One problem is that large deliberations are inherently stupid. It's not that the voters are too stupid, it's that the process is too stupid, that when you have large voters, it's not possible that they're going to thoughtfully, intelligently sit down with each other and come up with coherent conversations. Some will do that in small groups, but the small groups tend to be like-minded. And one of the things is that the juries don't have to be experts, because the experts will make their presentations to the juries. And one of the things is that the juries choose an expert outside foreman from recommendations by prior juries. In other words, when your jury is done deliberating and your jury had chosen a foreman to guide you, that foreman worked for you, and when you're done, you can give your opinion of that foreman with comments, with ratings and comments, and the subsequent juries will have that. So the first thing a new jury will do is choose a foreman, and they will look at what all the prior juries had to say about the various foremen, and we'll pick somebody good. And also, you can get rid of a foreman if you think a foreman is not being representative, you know, is not. If you think a foreman is being too bossy or has some other problem, the jury can fire him and hire a new one. The problem of a non-representative sample, you know, there's random sampling and there's representative sampling, and this is what pollsters do. Pollsters, instead of having a random sample, they will say, we're going to have a certain number of blacks or a certain number of women and men. You know, they will tailor their thing to try to make it more representative. This is very, you know, this is very difficult to do when your jury is actually making decisions because who does this becomes the question. Whoever does this has a great deal of power. Pollsters at least have a market incentive in that they are trying to make a prediction, you know, of how people will vote in the actual election. And if their prediction is wrong, they discredit themselves. So pollsters have an incentive to at least do this right. I trust market selection better than other things. And there's some things you can't select for. There's so many different things. People who are self-employed versus people who work for small businesses versus people who work for large corporations. People who are libertarian versus authoritarian, or conservative versus liberal, or whatever. So, so the only way you can get around that is to have larger juries, and to have grand juries are, we think of a jury, the standard jury is 12 people. Sometimes there are juries of 6 people, but grand juries are usually 24 people. And then you can have multiple jury stages. So you can have one jury screen the candidates, one jury select the candidates. And diminishing unanimity means, suppose you have your first jury, your first decision jury looks through all the people that passed the screening, and they say, okay, here's 10 candidates that passed the screening, and we're going to pick one. Well, if they unanimously pick one, you're done. And maybe you can set it so if at least 9 agree on one person, you're done. But if they can't come to that agreement of 9, you can convene another jury, and that other jury can pick somebody else with a unanimity of 9, a supermajority of 9. Or they can pick that person again with a supermajority of 8 or 7. And so it keeps getting easier to pick somebody. If you don't pick somebody, the next jury will have less of a requirement for a supermajority. That's the concept of that. Now, the most productive meeting size is 5 members. This has been Deming and other people who talk about corporate efficiency say that the ideal meeting size, the ideal size of a committee is 5 people. Now, he's not worried about being representative. He's worried about getting maximum input without chaos. So what he found in these studies is that if you have fewer than 5 people, you tend not to get the richness of variety that you would get with 5 people or more. But when you get more than 5 people, you tend to get more people talking over each other, and more difficulty maintaining the thread of an idea. So the most productive size is 5, but 5 has a problem with being representative. So the tradition of the jury being 12 minimizes the chance of bias and still has an acceptable level of chaos. Not a perfect level, but better than what we're used to. Now, jury tampering is illegal for both the juror and the tamperer, where voter tampering is standard procedure. Jury tampering is dangerous because a juror might get outraged and turn you in, or you might get caught some other way. Voter tampering is institutionalized, and in very important cases, you can have multiple juries. So one jury, if change or a constitutional change for your state constitution, you can have multiple juries. So one jury proposes the constitutional change, and a second jury or even a second and third jury have to ratify the change. Or you can still have an actual referendum to ratify the change if you don't trust the jury system enough. I think a lot of these juries would initially be recommending to the general public that we would phase these juries in, not by giving them final authority, but by having people create these juries, and then the juries would make their recommendation to the voter, and the voters, as the voters grew more and more confident with the jury system, they would tend to rubber stamp the juries. Another problem is domination by one or more juror, and the most eloquent juror tends to dominate. the most insistent juror tends to dominate. Sometimes jurors can be bullies, and there's documented evidence of that, of trials. There were mistrials because they found that some jurors had bullied other jurors. And then there's the shame and blame game that we see everywhere. If you disagree with this, you're a racist or homophobe or whatever. That can go on within juries. But it's still better than in the public arena, I think. So, so how do you minimize domination? And this is where the importance of an expert foreman comes in. The foreman serves at the pleasure of the jury, and the foreman is respectful of the jurors, but also makes sure the jurors are respectful of each other. Now, another problem is that the jury system that we're familiar with is passive. That means it's a trial in front of a jury, but it's a trial by the judge and by the attorneys, and the juries just sit there and listen and try to stay awake. And sometimes the jurors are allowed to submit questions to the judge, but the judge decides whether the questions will get actually answered. And what I'm proposing is a trial that's actually a trial by the jury. So, so the jury picks the foreman, who plays the same role as a judge does. The judge charges, this is what the judge instructs the jury on what their job is. Well, the foreman instructs the jury as well, but the jury actually picked the foreman, or previous juries picked the foreman, if you want to do it that way. And the jury controls that process under the advice and leadership of the foreman. And jurors review written submissions and decide whom to hear. So if you're choosing a candidate, they might get 100 applications to be a candidate, or they might get 1,000, and they'll break down into small groups, and some of them will just be, this is ridiculous, this person's not qualified. But the jurors will screen the candidates and narrow it down to some manageable amount and interrogate those and narrow it down some more. And they might not pick the final candidate. You might have a second stage for that juror or for that candidate, so that a second jury would, the first jury might narrow it down to 3 people or 5 people, and then the second jury would narrow it down and make that final choice. The other problem is that people escape jury duty, and jurors should be well paid. Service should be voluntary, like voting, and the pay should be high enough. If too many people are not accepting jury service, then you should increase the pay. And I don't know what the factor should, whether it should be 50, the pay should be high enough that 50% of the people accept, or 75% of the people accept. Or you could have the prior jury at the end say, no, the next jury should be paid better. They don't get to vote on their own pay, but they get to decide what the next jury should be paid, and you can up it 10% or something, because these juries would occur fairly often. And the pay scale, when I say the pay scale should decline over time, that means you get your full pay. Say we anticipate that you're going to do this for a month, and you're going to spend the month and find the best candidate. Well, if you want to continue for longer than a month, you're not going to get full pay for the second month, and you'll get even smaller pay for the third month. So the pay scale should not suddenly cut you off abruptly, but it should encourage people to do the job in an expeditious fashion. And culturally, we should make it an honor to serve in the jury. We can have a jury day celebration. It could be the 4th of July, or it could be some other day, but we have a big celebration. We have a public lottery, and we say, these are the people who have been chosen for the various juries, and those people should be honored for accepting jury duty. So those are devices I have in mind that would help make the juries more effective. So the different kinds of juries, there can be a candidate screening jury, a final selection jury, an oversight jury. I didn't talk about this at all. But once a person is in office, you can have a jury kind of looking over his shoulder. And if it's a jury of 12, then every month a new person can come on to that jury. And one of the people chosen by lottery at first can go off that jury. And then you can have a recall jury. And the recall jury is like if the oversight jury says, no, this guy's not doing a good job, they call up a recall jury who has a trial to remove him. It's not really like an impeachment because they don't have to convict him of treason like impeaching a president is an ordeal, but a recall jury can just say, no, we don't think you're doing a good job, and we can recall you. And then an interim person can be given the job, and a new jury can select a permanent replacement or a long-term replacement. For amending a corporate charter or a constitution or a home rule charter for a city, a jury can propose amendments to that, and another jury can ratify those amendments. And the process is very similar for the candidate selection jury. So that's the kind of types of juries. And I've been talking in terms of government. Does anybody have any questions before I get into the different, because I want to get into juries for corporations and for foundations, but did anybody have any questions first? Is anybody?
How do the pool of candidates that the juries are reviewing, where do they come from?
From just a list of citizens, like I mean, our current juries are selected from the voter pools, and since jury duty is so unappealing to most people, it actually discourages people from registering to vote.
Yeah, I'm not asking about how the juries get picked. If they're supposed to be reviewing candidates, how do the list of candidates that they're reviewing, how does that get picked?
No, anybody who wants the job submits an application, just like for any other job, except instead of submitting it to a personnel committee, which you would do if you were applying to a corporation, you might, you submit your application to the human relations department or to the employer himself or whatever. This application you would submit to the jury. Some administrator might collect the applications, but he should have no discretionary power over which applications get forwarded to the jury. So the jury can the jury can hire somebody to screen out the facetious applications, I would say. Or they can do it themselves, that they can go through them by committee.
Oh, okay. Thanks.
So let me go back to the screen share again. This is Oh, there it is. So the next thing I wanted to talk about is corporate democracy, because corporate democracy poses a special problem. In government, all citizens are considered to be equal. But in corporate democracy, the largest investors are given the most influence, which in a way makes sense. But the problem is that one or two very large investors can control a corporation, and all the small investors have no say at all. So when the current thing is one share or $1 invested is one vote, and this is compared to one person, one vote. So the largest shareholder gets, in this case, the blue wedge in the pie is the largest shareholder has 35% of the vote. Well, the reality in large corporations is that the small shareholders don't even show up at the meetings. So people with 15% of the stock often totally control the corporation. They have a majority of votes because there's so many shareholders who don't show up at all. And they don't show up because they know they're not going to prevail. And also because they don't have that big a stake in the thing. But if you left it to one person, one vote, all those small shareholders could dominate the thing and totally squeeze out the large investors. So the idea here is, if you're the largest shareholder, you get the most lottery tickets, if you want to call them that, to be on the jury. So if you own 35% of the shares and you are in a jury of 6 people, then each time there's a jury, you have a 93.5% chance of being selected to be on that jury. So you'll be on most of the juries with a 35% share. And if you're a 1% shareholder, you'll be on 5.9% of the juries. And if you're a 0.1% shareholder, you'll be on 0.6% of the juries. It's not a totally linear relationship, but it means that a jury would be almost always have the largest or one of the 2 or 3 largest shareholders sitting on it, but that shareholder would only be 1% of the vote. Now, if it's a jury of 12, that largest shareholder will be on 99.5% of all the juries. In other words, out of 200 juries, chances are he'll be on 199 of them. So that largest shareholder will be on almost all the larger juries, but he still only has 1 vote out of 12 instead of 1 vote out of 6. And that 1% shareholder will only be on 12% of the juries, and the 0.1% will be on 1.2% of the juries. So even when it's a jury of 12, the smaller the shareholder you are, the less likely you'll be on. But you're much more likely on a jury of 12 than on a jury of 6. The problem is you have 1 vote out of 12 instead of 1 vote out of 6.
Chuck has a question. Chuck's commented, most U.S. corporations nowadays are owned largely by other corporations, ETFs, mutual funds, etc. Want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think I have that further down, but the main thing is the idea I have is that only people, if I was setting this up, I would only want people to do this because, a corporation that's owned by other corporations, that other and this can be true even in the current system, quite often there's what's called common stock and preferred stock. And preferred stock doesn't vote, but But if there's a bankruptcy, preferred stock gets paid first. Preferred stock is somewhere between what we usually think of as stock. It's between common stocks and bonds. So preferred stock is something that you get, and I have no problem with that. I have a problem with corporations controlling other corporations generally. So I would recommend, if it was a business that I'm trying to set up or something, I would say that only human beings can serve on the jury, and the human being has to not be a representative of a corporation. He has to be ostensibly his shares in the company cannot be collateral. They cannot be indirectly controlled by another corporation. You have no way of knowing that, but if the other corporation tries to hold that as collateral, you can say, well, you know, it was clear in the stock that it's not collateral, so that can come out in that court contention. But anyhow, the corporations owning corporations applies. And also, I'm going to talk about nonprofit corporations and donors. And the same thing applies there, that persons who donated would have a share of the vote, but other foundations that donated would, they basically control whether to give the money as a foundation, but they don't control the foundation they gave the money to in that way. There it is. Only human beings can serve on these things. And the reason is jurors think for themselves, and a corporation owning another corporation is a power relationship. It's not a service relationship. So we're asking people to serve and deliberate as human beings. The people who are against publicly traded corporations will point out that corporations have no soul. And my retort is corporations also have no brains, that a corporation is relying on the brains of other people. It's the same problem that socialism and communism has, is that the people who are running it are not running it for themselves. They are, you know, there's a connection between ownership and control that should be there. And as we move into nonprofits, my second one is wrong. It's for nonprofits, it's the same thing. The jurors should select the board members of the nonprofit just like they select the board members of the corporation. And this lottery should be based on lifetime donations, not lifetime membership. So it should be all the donations you have ever made to this corporation. And if you want to be on the board, and I recommend putting large donors on the board, but they should recuse themselves from the selection jury in order to be on the board. So, so there is a long tradition of putting donors on boards because nobody raises money better than the people who've given money, for one thing. But this allows donors to be on this jury even if they don't want to be on the board. And they can also be on the fundraising committee even if they don't want to be on the board. And the board is still dominated indirectly by those who give. So, you know, the board might not be composed of those who have given, but it serves at the pleasure of those who have given. And the reason it's lifetime is because a lifetime commitment is worth more than last year's commitment. And large foundations can be hijacked. A foundation with a huge endowment but gets small annual donations, people can donate this year and end up dominating a jury. But if it's lifetime donations, then all the donors who are still alive have equal say no matter when they donated. So that prevents that hijacking. And the other thing is that experience counts. Somebody who's been involved in the foundation for a long time and who began donating a long time ago has been paying attention for a long time. So I think there's several good arguments to make it based on lifetime donations as opposed to recent donations. And yeah, if you want to be on the board, you should recuse yourself because it's a conflict of interest if you're evaluating your own seat, and it's awkward. I mean, people are going to deliberate on whether to accept you while you're in the room. That's awkward. And this is easier to do if you have staggered terms. So if you have a board of 9 people and you choose, and they have 3-year terms and there's 3 each term, then when you want to be on the board, you just step down for 1 term. Or if the lottery didn't choose you to select the board this term, you can submit your application this term. So that's
Wynn had a comment. Wynn had a comment about pension funds. They're not usually very activist oriented. Index funds own increasingly numbers of the shares. Yeah,
there's a lot of stocks that are voting stocks, but the owners just don't pay attention. And pension funds and mutual funds generally, they don't, because the mutual fund company has, possibly hundreds or even thousands of different stocks, and they're not going to get involved in running the company. And that reduces the number of, that is one of the reasons why you can totally control a corporation with 10 or 15% of that stock. And that's also why you're subjected to corporate raiders, because corporate raiders, if you're controlling the company with 15% of the stock and some corporate raider gets in there and acquires 20% of the stock, then your control is in jeopardy. And so the final thing I want to talk about, and this ties to, Sue, can you paste that thing into chat? I have a separate proposal for land trust. And I envision this kind of government for land trusts. So you can have juries for land trust for the shareholders of the board, the people who put up the money to create the land trust, would have their own jury with its own defined sphere of influence. And that jury is chosen proportional to shares, just like the donor jury and the corporate jury. And the leaseholder board is also proportional to the amount of land leased. So if you've leased a great deal of land, you are invited to serve on the jury in proportion to how much land you've leased. But the occupants board, the occupant is one person, one chance to be in the lottery. And I haven't completely sorted through this, but there's a residents are occupants, but workers can also be occupants. So if you have a largely commercial, like a shopping mall or something, that you can have, the workers can have an area of influence that is theirs, and their area of influence, it would apply to things like, if we have money, taxes to rebate, what are we going to rebate? Well, the workers would want to rebate maybe their wage tax or their contribution to Social Security or unemployment compensation or whatever. And employers can include the self-employed or working for themselves. So so that anybody who's working on site, whether as management or production,
Ed has a comment.
working.
What,
Yes.
in your view, is the advantage of jury democracy over selection of legislatures by lottery, subject to the person passing what amounts to a civil service examination in order to demonstrate basic competency? And then Wynn also had a comment.
Well, take one at a time.
Okay, that's that one.
So with Ed's thing, well, whoever writes the civil service exam is whoever controls the civil service exam is impinging on the political process.
Okay.
So that that creates a possible conflict, and also you don't want to get somebody who just passes a minimum standard. You want to get the best person you can. So if you have a jury that's carefully examining all the candidates, and they're going to get the best candidate they can, that should be a better candidate than you would get through elections or through a civil service exam, I think.
Okay.
It's the first time I've heard that question, so I'm not totally confident of the answer to that. But I see Chuck Metalit said, "Oh wow, who designs the civil service exam?" Yeah, that would be my concern too.
Right. Do you see Wynn's comment about juries for land trust democracies, shareholder board proportional to shares, leaseholder board?
No, I don't see.
That's in there. She's asking.
Well, just read it.
Okay. Her comment was, juries for land trust democracies, shareholder board proportional to shares, leaseholder board proportional to land lease, occupancy board, one person, one lottery chance, possible.
Okay, well, she just pasted that from my slide. Was there?
Yeah, and that came that.
Is there a question?
Yeah.
About that.
Okay. You wanted the comments of the slide put into the chat. Skip it. Okay. Well, it came way down. All right.
Yeah, I can put my I can put the whole slideshow online, or write it up into a paper that's online.
Please do.
But partly I wanted to get some thoughts because I haven't I haven't tested this with other people. I've given it a lot of thought, in my own little monastery isolation, but I haven't, and I've researched, similar ideas, but I haven't really thrown it out at other people who would pick it apart. So if anybody has thoughts on improving it or testing it, that would be a good idea. I see a new message. Steve Shafferman, I'm sorry. Am I involved with any land trusts or other groups that might implement this? No, it's strictly within my little monastery. I'm involved with a couple people who are wanting to start private investment land trusts. My problem is with most land trusts is that they seem to be put together by people who are in opposition to making the market work. And the idea behind a Georgist land trust is to remove the obstacles that prevent the market from working right. And usually most land trusts have a concept of justice, and they want to create a little oasis of justice inside a sea of injustice. So most of the land trusts I know are conservation trusts or organic farming trusts or trust trust designed to keep rent artificially low. And when you keep this trust would make the rent lower than it is under a land monopoly system, but it wouldn't be dramatically lower. But it would overcome obstacles to people buying a house. I mean, they could lease some land, they could throw a trailer on it, they could tear the trailer down, sell the trailer, put a house on it. They could do those things more easily than they could in a gentrifying neighborhood. But as soon as you start saying we're going to prevent the rent from going up, you end up with people who are trapped in their homes because you usually have a provision that if you sell it, you don't get the capital gains or the asset gains. It's really a land gain, so I don't like to say capital gain. But you don't get the gain if you sell. So a lot of people end up staying in these trusts because they only get the market value if they stay there and enjoy that market value personally. But as soon as they think about leaving, another person coming in is paying under the market value. So there's usually a long line of people waiting to get in. And the trust doesn't get that revenue, which means it can't buy more land. So Mike is probably still on. Mike's the one who...
No, Mike has left.
Oh, okay.
But Wynn has a comment about...
Okay, well, Mike pointed out that in Arden, the people who pay an artificially low rent capitalize that into an artificially high purchase price, so that a lease in Arden sells for more than a deed in the surrounding territories. Time might be right to bring this into the racial justice arena. I'm thinking of a coalition in southern Delaware. I'm not too familiar with the demographics of southern Delaware, except that I guess it's kind of near Baltimore. I would like to share the slides and video with them, by all means. Yeah, and I also have a paper called Land Tenure and Race that's on my website that talks about how, I don't like the term white privilege, because not everybody who's white has the privileges, and not everybody who's black doesn't have the privileges. So I know, like somebody said, it doesn't matter that my family was starving in Ireland during slavery, that I'm white and I should contribute to the reparations. And I said, well, does it matter that Kamala Harris's father said that they descended from slave owners? So she's black, she's part black, and I'm all white, and yet I should pay reparations to her. So the reparations issue has some very knotty problems in it, but the white privilege issue has some similar problems. But it's true that most of the that home ownership is much higher among whites than it is among blacks. And then when you get to ownership of commercial properties, there's very little, there's some, but there's very little black ownership of commercial properties. And there's very few black landlords. So, so I want to make the case that there is privilege that tends to be white, that would benefit, and abolishing the privilege of land monopoly would benefit most white people, but it wouldn't benefit a much higher percentage of black people, and to a greater degree, because black people tend to live on lower value land. So that's that. And when added to this, yeah, chicken farms and beef, this is in southern Delaware. Chicken farms and beach resorts, mostly red hat. I'm not sure what red hat means.
Probably MAGA hat. Does it mean MAGA hat, maybe?
It's Trump that has.
Oh, it might be. And assessments are from the early 70s. So, yeah, and I haven't read the New York Times reparation article. New York Times has struck me as having deteriorated recently. But yeah, I think I think Henry George said something about reparations, and it was that we're not trying to correct past injustices. We're trying to correct ongoing injustices, and that if you want to address past injustices, you still have to correct the ongoing injustices first. So we have the situation that Winston Churchill talked about, and this applies to everything, not just reparations, is that as soon as you give anything to poor people who are poor, their rent goes up. And it's not that they blow the money. It's not that we'll give this money, these reparations to Black people, many of whom are poor. You know, the complaint is, well, they'll spend the money, and the first thing you know, they'll be poor again. And no, that's not the dynamic. The dynamic is you give reparations to poor people, and if the reparations are substantial, the first thing you know, rent will go up in poor neighborhoods. And the people who are paying for the reparations, which I assume are rich people, and they'll be taxed more, well, then rent will go down in rich neighborhoods. And until you come to grips with the word rent comes from the word to rend or tear away. So the word rent literally means ripoff. That's where the word rent comes from, a word meaning to rip off. And so my response is not that it's too late to talk about reparations, but it's actually too soon, because it's not an ancient injustice that's holding Black people down. It's an ongoing injustice. And if you want to see evidence of that, well, the first state to replace property taxes with sales tax was Mississippi. And they did it so that rich plantation owners wouldn't have to sell their land. And if they don't have to sell it, then Blacks have a harder time buying their own land and becoming free. And the abolitionists, the ones who are talking about 40 acres and a mule, were not talking about reparations immediately. One of them mentioned it incidentally. Well, this is the least we can do to compensate them for all the generations of slavery. But that was always a secondary mention, if it was mentioned at all. The primary mention was that people who do not have their own land are not free. And this is not just Henry George saying this. This is the abolitionists and the Freedmen's Bureau, the people who were in charge of, the Freedmen's Bureau's job was to look after the newly freed slaves and help them avoid falling back into the trap of dependence on their former masters. And this is what they all said. They have to have, if they don't have their own land, they will forever be dependent on the same people that had enslaved them. And so yeah, I'd like to see us attack that question as something that's necessary before we even get into reparations. And really, once this justice came about, I think the reparations issue would fade. It would be, okay, well, you're not screwing us from year to year anymore, and we're doing all right now. As soon as we stop bleeding rent from people, they'll start to do better. And when you look at poor ghetto neighborhoods, they are almost entirely absentee owned, which means there's not only an individual transfer from the individual tenant to an individual landlord, but there's an aggregate transfer that lots and lots of money is going out of this community into the landlord community. So you're not only a tenant, but all your neighbors are tenants. And you have a kid who could cut grass for a living, but all your neighbors are cutting their own grass because they can't afford to pay somebody to cut grass. And you go to the landlord community, and even if you're not a landlord, your kid can make a good living mowing lawns for landlords. And your kid can clean the landlord's swimming pool. And, you know, there's lots of ways for a, you know, I grew up in a not a middle class, but a middle income suburb. And when I was a teenager, I mowed lawns and I cleaned swimming pools, and I made, you know, decent money doing things like that. That's not available to really poor kids in really poor tenant communities. So yeah, there's a racial component, and so instead of saying white privilege, I say there's privilege that tends to be white, and there's tribute that tends to be black. And I think that's something that the race issue if we can get the moderates into this, and because the race issue seems to be polarized between the ones who want to vilify and aren't really solving anything, and the ones who want to deny that there's any privilege at all. So anyhow, is there any other?
I don't see anything. Though several people have asked for your slides, so that if you could post them before you edit this footage, they'd appreciate it. Maybe possibly put those out on your website.
Yeah, I'll put it. There's a. It's on my website as Council of Georgist CGO/videos. I think it's on my savingcommunities.org website.
Mm-hmm.
But
so the slides are already there.
No, they're not. But I'll upload them right away.
Okay, that's what several people have asked for, and then you can, when you get the video, and the videos, incidentally, of everything we've done during this conference, as soon as they're edited, are put up on the CGO YouTube channel for your viewing pleasure.
Yeah, so it's savingcommunities.org/CGO/videos. And it'll say jury.odp, I think it is. It's whatever. I don't use Microsoft's system. I use LibreOffice. Maybe that's why my slides didn't work.
Don't know. Ed has a question.
Yes.
As for the civil service examination, perhaps one of your expert juries could perform this task.
Well, the task
of doing the civil service examination for the candidates.
An expert jury you could have one expert jury that crafts a civil service examination and sends it out. And that examination might be used as a device to screen the people who are just simply not qualified. And then you would still have a final selection process by the jurors. And so the person who actually holds what is now an elected office would not truly be a civil servant. But, you know, that sounds like a good way if you get 1,000 applicants for a job and 900 of them are clearly not qualified. A civil service exam might objectively give you a very minimum standard. I'd be more concerned about accidentally screening out somebody who is qualified. And I'm also concerned about the federal government tampering with the standard. You know, we give extra points to veterans, and in some cases that's useful, but in the case of like police, we give extra points to veterans, and then there are provisions in there that you can't bypass a veteran even if he doesn't seem right to you. So what you have is you have police who have their experiences as an occupying army, and that's actually not a good qualifier for being a policeman. You want an Andy Griffith type of candidate for your policeman, not a Clint Eastwood type of candidate. And so people in occupying forces, they tend to have a slight bias toward the public as enemy, and they also have a high incidence of post-traumatic stress disorder. So, I'm sympathetic to these policemen, but if that's their problem, we should help them in other ways. We should not help them become policemen. So, civil service exams, I think, did an important job, because before we had civil service exams, we had pure patronage. And I think this is an improvement over civil service exams. So
I've come on live.
Okay.
I do want to engage you on this issue a little bit more in more depth. The fundamental problem I see is that we do not teach civics to our young people, not in any systematic way. There's a problem with that too, because being taught in public schools, the question is what values would be taught and by whom and what would their qualifications be. I mean, I realize this is not an easy problem to solve, but it seems to me we're old enough that you and I think many people on this call took civics, maybe more than 1 year of it, when we went through middle school and high school. But it seems to me that is something that our schools need to get back to teach every young person what's the function of government, what are the powers of government, how is government organized, what is the citizen's responsibility. Doesn't solve the issue of bias, but it would certainly create a much more a citizenry when they become adults, ready for the responsibility of being a legislator, whether or not they're selected by your jury system or by a lottery system.
Yeah, and being taught civics would make you a better juror as well. My concern is that education generally is, and this brings up another issue, which is voucher education. My problem with education is that it is either controlled by government or it is controlled by wealthy alumni. Private schools, I don't see private schools as dramatically better than public schools, because the wealthy alumni have their own biases. And quite often, the wealthy alumni's bias is completely compatible with what you would call the socialist or bureaucratic bias. Mason Gaffney detailed this in The Corruption of Economics, that the schools of economics were created by the large monopoly corporations who basically contrived economics to be something perverse compared to what it had been. Prior to that, schools were controlled by religions, and there's a bias issue there. But I think if you had voucher education, schools would be competing for students instead of competing for rich alumni and for government money. And that would that would totally change the nature of education. It would change the nature of schooling, and I think it would make civics vastly superior to even what it was when I took it in the
Dark ages.
mid 60s. Yeah.
You have to have exactly equal vouchers for every student, wouldn't you?
Well, it depends. Vouchers can be locally funded, so that if it's more expensive to teach kids in a big city, the city can have its own vouchers. The state can have vouchers. I like to see things funded from a land value tax, so I'm inclined to want to see more local funding because states are less likely to use land value tax. Although there are states with, New Hampshire and Maryland and some other states have statewide property taxes. So
yeah, if you had it local, then the poor neighborhood, people in poor neighborhoods would get very tiny vouchers, and it wouldn't give them any choice at all.
well, if it's funded from a land value tax, when you find out that poor neighborhoods tend to be absentee owned. So when you're funding something from a land value tax, you're not really taking the money from the poor people who live there. You're taking the money from the people who own it.
Yeah.
And to the degree that, in a way, it would still be a higher rate, and it would still be a higher rate even on those poor people who live there. But you're diverting an outflow of money. That money that's being collected by rent as absentee landowners, as soon as you tax that money, you're diverting that rent that was going out of your community, and you're giving it to teachers who live in your community or near your community, and who will spend that money in your community or near your community. So you're kind of, it's always been the poorest communities that went to land value tax. It's, the rich, Walt Riebeck got called to speak to Falls Church, Virginia, which is like just across the Virginia line from DC, and it's a relatively rich community. And they said, well, we don't want growth and development. And Walt Riebeck said, well, then I guess you might not want this tax. And other Georgists got all upset at him. And he said, I'm here to be, if I'm going to be an expert to people and put myself out there, I got to tell them the truth. And if you're fat and happy in your community, then maybe you're going to be the last people to go for land value tax. You will go for it when all the other people have had it, because you'll find out that you're not fat and happy anymore when other people have it. But yeah, and there can still be some state funding for public education. But you get to the point where, well, Alabama is poorer than Connecticut too. So do you need federal funding for education? And the United States is richer than Nigeria. So do you need global funding for education? You can make an argument for it, but it has to primarily be local, I think, or else, because with funding comes control.
Yeah, I agree. As long as it is from land value tax, which is always the rub for anything, from permaculture to anything, is that in order to make it work, you have to have land value tax.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of things that just work better with land value tax.
Yeah.
So,
Paul's got a question.
Okay.
Comment and question. I'm just reading a book called Humankind by a Rutger Bregman, who's a Dutch guy. But he's done a lot of, well, his thesis of the book is that humans are much more cooperative than we give them credit for under the right circumstances. So he reports on a lot of things, but one is this community in Venezuela. It's called Torres, a community of 200,000 people. And there were factions, there were people running for mayor. One was a great landlord, and other was a Chavez kind of stooge or something. But anyway, a third mayor won, and he was a real revolutionary, and he actually turned the budget of $7 million annual budget to the people. They all met and discussed things and were given the real power to allocate the funds. And within a short period of time, they had better health care, there was lower infant mortality, the streets were fixed, and politicians, they couldn't steal the money because the citizens were involved in observing it. And so this has been repeated in many places around the world. Now, if only they had land value taxation too, then it would be, you know, real true democracy and things like that. But have you come across that? His book is called Humankind.
No, but I'm you know, when you're trying to improve Venezuela, you're setting the bar pretty low. I think that had they done a jury system, well, then the question is, you know, you have to have a very transparent lottery system. And I didn't include this in my, you know, problems with the jury thing, but how the jury is selected is very important. And I said it's important that it be made random, but it's also very important that there be no, you know, what was the guy, Nick Perry in Pennsylvania, went to jail for tampering with the Pennsylvania lottery. The Pennsylvania lottery was ping pong balls that floated up by a blast of air, and he put a little bit of paint on some of the ping pong balls, and those balls didn't make it to the top. So, you know, I'd be very concerned about the system that tampers with the jury selection. And so you need a jury that oversees the selection of juries, I guess. And it needs to be very, very public, that everybody gets to inspect the lottery wheel or whatever it is that you used.
Dan, what do you think about certain things? I can't think of the term, and Chuck has to correct me on this, but there was an alderman in Chicago who basically brought city budgets to his constituents, and they had constituent hearings on the budgets and what they thought their ward particularly wanted. And this guy was in power for a good 10, maybe possibly 15 years and the like. But it was interesting that was a ward that was really well run for a while.
I don't know. And it's something that sounds interesting, but you never know how much of that was done for show and how much of it resulted in the budget being what they wanted.
I'm not sure. I'd start 50-50 on that one, but it was an
I mean, it's probably, I mean, he probably has some discretion over earmarking things for his district.
Right, and I would assume that.
And that's where it would, that's where it would come into play. Steve Schafferman wrote, yes to Ed's comments about a lack of education in civics without systematic education. Americans today are passively indoctrinated to be consumers first and thus to disparage government. Yeah, I agree with that. And I would add that part of the problem is that voting is a passive system, that the voter just sits and listens to all the, you know, the voter is bombarded with propaganda and then chooses based on, not on anything that he has reasoned out with other voters, but based on the information that he received. So he's like that jury, the passive, the difference between a trial by jury and a trial in front of a jury is that the voters are not, they're not interacting, they're not deliberating. So naturally the voters are passive. And I think that people would be much more interested in civics if they said, you know, I'm going to be chosen, you know, sooner or later, I'm probably going to be chosen to be on one of these juries. So, so that's, yeah, that goes, and voucher education goes in with that too, because I think most parents want their kids to have that. You know, at least they would want the first thing they want for their kids is to make a decent living. But as soon as that is nailed down, the next thing they want is for their kids to be well-rounded. My best friend in elementary school, and well, we didn't go to high school, but he was still my best friend when I was in high school. His father made a good living. He worked in the steel mill, and he got incentive pay. If you have a job with incentive pay in the mill, you work great. And he had he lived in a nice suburb. He had a brick house. He had a small yard, but he had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 kids. And he put the oldest ones through college, and then the oldest ones helped him put the next oldest one through college. And he did this all on a mill worker's salary. And he had a 3rd grade education. He read the newspaper, but he always talked about wanting his kids to get a good education so they wouldn't be stupid like he was. And I felt sad about it because he didn't come across to me as stupid, but he had just a low opinion of himself because he didn't get past the 3rd grade. And I look at education, I think education is overhyped as a vocational device. And it's really something that you fight for it because you value it. And if you value it, you will get a better education because it's not just given to you. So I have mixed feelings about free education. I think given that we don't have economic justice, the only thing poor people get that, my attitude about public welfare generally is that people on welfare, the corporate welfare, you're giving to people who are already collecting tribute in the form of rent. At least with the welfare you give to poor people, you're giving something to the rent payers as opposed to the rent collectors. And so, when my libertarian people complain about welfare, yeah, it's got a lot of problems. It's led to a lot of unwed motherhood because you lose your welfare benefits if your working father is in the home. But in terms of a fundamental moral thing, you're giving money to people who are net rent payers. And so I would always make, corporate welfare reform to be a priority over personal welfare reform. So, and Steve, I'm not sure what date we have set for the word.
Steve is on for July 26th, I believe. Steve's going to talk about his book.
Yeah, we're going to talk about basic income. Steve has written, he's talked about his first book, and he's written the second book, which I have here that I looked through a little bit, and he's going to talk about basic income and the connection with land value tax. And we Georgists often stress that land value tax is necessary for basic income because otherwise the rent will eat most of it. But I think there's also a case to be made that basic income is necessary for land value tax because at least giving basic income to people over 65 is necessary before you can you can't shift from wage tax to land value tax because retirees will go nuts. But if you have at least a basic income as a social security supplement, you say, okay, we're at least going to give a basic income to everybody age 65 and over, then you remove an obstacle to shifting to property tax or land value tax, because you say, yeah, older people are paying more in property tax, but except for the richest ones, they're getting as much in a basic income as they're getting an increase in their property taxes. So, yeah, so basic income clears, and Steve said yes, and it's a means to win other reforms as well. So, yeah, that's true. I mean, you want to, you know, we say, well, why don't we levy a whopping tax on fossil fuels? Well, because poor people have to heat their homes. Well, you give them a basic income, and if they heat their homes with it, they break even. And if they buy a sweater, they come out ahead. You know, set their temperature down and dress warmer, they come out ahead. So there's lots of things that make economic sense, and they say, well, we can't do that because it's regressive. Well, as soon as you stick in a little more basic income, you can do that.
On Tuesday, we've got coming up, Dan is going to be back here on the show with Ted Gortney moderating with him and Josh Vincent and Gib Halverson. All three of these, all four have experience working with elected officials, and there'll be handouts and a lot. Sounds to be quite good. I have looked at the handouts already. So we'll be back here at 7 o'clock on Tuesday.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's.
And yeah, Gib was a legislative aide, and so he knows from the inside. And Josh and I have worked with elected officials and sat down with them and had a sense of what their concerns were. And all that will be kind of be the focus next week of how you deal with elected officials and what their concerns are. Because what our concerns are don't matter, really. And they matter in terms of why we talk to an elected official. But in terms of what you say to them, it's about their concerns. So that is that Tuesday?
That's Tuesday, day after tomorrow.
That's day after tomorrow. And then Steve is July 24th. What do we have for next Sunday?
Next Sunday, we are off. But the 7th, we're going to be doing some activism workshops.
Oh, next Sunday is a holiday weekend, right?
Right. We're not on next Sunday, okay, for Canada Day and for the 4th of July. Okay. The 12th.
And there's a day in England too. I think it's just called spring break or something in England.
Yeah. The 7th will be, we'll have some activists on from, we're going to try to get some footage of Rich Nymon and Tom Gearing, who were at the 19 conference, and Mary Rose Kazarowski. And when will the rest of the schedule be posted? When I sent it to you last night, but I'll resend it to you. If others would like it, I believe I have posted it. I may have posted it last night, but I will post it. There are a couple of, we're waiting to hear from some people from, they want to talk on on the situation in Northern Ireland. Our final thing will be July 28th. It will be our Economic Justice Award.
Well, it won't be our final thing. We'll keep doing this.
We'll continue, but low key, he's going to do it, not me. Hey, it's the Dan Sullivan show. I'm going to take a few days off. But anyway, we're going to do something like what we have right now. We're actually, Asamu is going to have some sort of refreshments. He's going to come up with something. He and Mark are working on this so that some people complain, well, we're not seeing faces. Well, this time we will see faces and things. So that's what we're doing. So, and for those of you who hold a vote, the board, our annual meeting will be Saturday, the 11th at 2 o'clock. So that's what's up.
Yeah. And one of the things is, one of the problems we have with our annual meeting is that we have to plan out the program way in advance. And then after we've completely planned out the program, we always get people who, can I have this in the program? Can I have that in the program? And well, we've already printed the brochures. We've already completely filled the program. We're slightly overbooked, and so we can't add anything. And the conference is normally 3 consecutive days plus an evening beforehand and a morning afterward. And it's kind of a marathon, and people have to travel to it. So they have to know what's worth traveling to well in advance of making their decision. And now the decision is just to show up on a Tuesday evening or a Sunday afternoon or late morning on the West Coast. And we have things that come up that we can insert that, we didn't get Jack Wagner till shortly before last Tuesday. So we inserted that on fairly short notice. And there's things that come up like, can we have a program that responds to the rioting and looting, or how are we going to recover from the quarantine, or all this? Well, if we'd have planned this completely out in advance, there would be no room for that. So
No room. We're talking about, incidentally, just so you can save the date, the approximate same weekend that we were going to be in Scranton this year. We'll be in Scranton. We hope to be in Scranton. We've all agreed on the planning committee that it will be more networking, because we've all missed that this year, than sessions. It will be a very relaxed atmosphere at this point. So that's what we're saying. We're not to our knowledge, we're not in conflict with anything.
Yeah, our conferences have been very program heavy because people wanted the programs. And if we are program heavy all year, if we're doing a weekly or bi-weekly, if we're doing every Sunday or every other Sunday and every Tuesday or every other Tuesday, we don't need to do that as much on. So we can,
and we love your ideas.
So we can focus on, we can have much more emphasis on hospitality and socializing and glad handing and getting to know each other and planning strategies to take over the world, like Pinky in the Brain. And so, yeah, the next year's conference might be substantially different because we're doing so much of this by way of Zoom.
Yeah, we're really becoming an educational organization. So
okay.
All right.
Well, but going back to the main thing, this presentation is made possible by the Robert Schalkenbach Foundation, primarily, and by added support from the Foundation for Economic Justice, the Henry George Institute, Common Ground USA, Earth Sharing Associates, and individual donors. And thank you all. And yeah, if you have any, sooner or later, this will be up on YouTube. And if you have any comments, throw them on the YouTube channel as well. So, and thank you, everybody. And I'll see you next session.
Yes, Tuesday. Take care. Thank you all.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.